Welcome everyone. We welcome you, Adrisha, and this is the third class in this series on Shemittah in the Mishnah, challenges and opportunities with Rabbi Avraham Walfish. Today's class will discuss the subject of boundaries of the land and use of Shemittah produce. We encourage everyone to turn on their video if you're able to. Also, during the class, you can feel free to ask questions either verbally by unmuting yourself, or you can write them at the chat box here on Zoom. If you're watching us live on Facebook, you can also type them as a comment on Facebook. We would love to hear from you as well, even if you're not present with us on Zoom. And now I'll turn it to Rabbi Walfish.
Okay, good evening. Nice to see everyone again. So let's first of all locate ourselves within Masechta Shevi'it. We've done half of the Masechta, the first 5 chapters. Tonight we have a tall order. We're going to look at 4 chapters, 6 through 9, and B'ezrat Hashem, the next class we will look at the last chapter, chapter 10. So the first 5 chapters we divided into two parts. The first 2 chapters deal with building up to Shemittah, preparing for the year of sanctity, preparing the land for its year of rest. Then the 3rd through 5th chapters all dealt with the practices during Shemittah. And as we saw, the emphasis in these chapters, chapter 3 is a kind of swing chapter. It opens with the theme of time, with the word me'ematai, which echoes ade matai. That's a key phrase in chapters 1 and 2. And in various places in the chapter, they talk about the timing of different practices. But chapter 3 also lays the groundwork for chapters 4 and 5, in the sense that it's dealing with the Shemitah year itself, and it introduces several themes that we saw were very central in chapters 4 and 5 as well. All of these chapters deal with what may and may not be done in the land during the Shemitah year, and a lot of the things that are being discussed are things that, in and of themselves, are not problematic, but might appear to be a problem. So we saw several key terms last time. The term marit ha'ayin, which is an unusual term in the Mishnah, and particularly in the way in which it's used in Masechta Shevi'it. And in particular, we saw, especially in chapters 4 and 5, a lot of terms that focus our attention on the society, how the society organizes itself to observe Shemitah. And that involves both acting in such a way as not to cast suspicion on yourself, but it also involves how one interacts with other people, both how legitimately one should interact with other people. Can I do things in someone else's field? And perhaps there are things I can do in someone else's field I can't do in my own field, because when I do it in my own field, it might appear to be a problematic, prohibited form of behavior. Whereas if I do it in somebody else's field, it's clear that I'm doing it with the correct intention. It also involves when I do enter someone else's field in order to benefit from their produce. Is that person entitled to expect some kind of appreciation on my part? Am I entitled to express appreciation? There's a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. So these have to do with permissible kinds of interactions. And then there are also the more challenging kinds of interactions that are dealt with quite extensively in chapters 4 and 5, and especially towards the end of chapter 5. And that has to do with transacting in various ways with people whose observance of Shemitah is suspect. And that includes, for example, can I give or sell different kinds of implements to someone during a Shemitah year when I know that this person is not a Shemitah observer. So if I sell him these products, it's very likely that he will use them for impermissible activities. And yet, the Mishnah goes out of its way to insist that until it is 100% clear that the person will definitely be using it for prohibited activity, then I should interact. Okay. In other words, there's there are two conflicting values here. The one value that the Mishnah calls Darchei Shalom is that we want to maintain the unity of the society, to keep the society as one social fabric. But on the other hand, we also want to maintain our fidelity to the mitzvot of the Torah and to the mitzvah of Shemitah in particular. So the Mishnah talks about how to balance those two conflicting goals, and takes us pretty far in the direction of bending the rules of Shemitah in order to maintain proper relationships within the society, but does in the end set limits upon that. Okay, so those were some of the highlights of what we saw in the first 5 chapters. And again, what unites all these 5 chapters is they're all dealing with how to work the land. First 2 chapters, how to prepare the land before we enter Shemitah, how to work the land before we actually enter into the Shemitah year. And in chapters 3 through 5, what I actually do and do not do on the land during the year of Shemitah. And now, chapter 6. Okay, let's share screen here. Okay, chapter 6 opens with Shalosh Aratzot L'Shvit. So again, we seem to be talking about land. And interestingly, this is the first place we see in the Mishnah that Shemitah is confined to the land of Israel. Okay, it's something that we would think is pretty obvious when we read the passages in the Torah, and we read psukim like Va'aretz lo timacher litzmitut ki li kol haaretz ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. The pasuk like that makes it very clear that we're talking about Eretz Yisrael. The opening of the passage of Shemitah in Vayikra chapter 25. Ki tavo el haaretz asher Hashem Elokechem noten lachem. This is the land God has given you. And then the message is, He gave it to us, but it's not an outright gift. He retains control over it, and Shemitah is one of the most dramatic expressions of how the land, in some very profound sense, doesn't really belong to us. Okay, but in the Mishnah, the first mention of Shemitah being confined to Eretz Yisrael is here at the beginning of chapter 6. And chapter 6 opens with 3 regions regarding Shevi'it, okay, and Kol Shech Ziku Olei Bavel, Kol Shech Ziku Olei Mitzrayim, and Mehanahar U'Me'amana V'Lifnim. Okay, so the 3 regions are the part of the land that was occupied by those who came up from Babylonia, part that was occupied by the ones who came up from Egypt, and from the river and Amanah and further, okay, which seems to be going into Syria, Lebanon, that area, okay, even though Syria is mentioned separately in the Mishnah, okay, what the Mishnah calls Syria is not all of what we would today call Syria, okay, but there is some region, okay, that goes beyond, okay, the part that was occupied by those who came up from Egypt. Okay, so now just before we go further in getting our overview of these 4 chapters that we're looking at this evening, okay, just a couple of words so we'll understand the terms here. Okay, Am Yisrael occupied the land of Israel twice. Okay, we, Baruch Hashem, are now living through the third Commonwealth. The first 2 Commonwealths were the Olei Mitzrayim, okay, the Jews coming up from Egypt 40 years afterwards, after they'd wandered through the wilderness. They conquered the land, settled the land, divided it among the tribes, and that lasts through pretty much all of the biblical period. Okay, it runs through the book of Melachim, the book of Divrei Hayamim, that outlines the history up to and including the destruction of the people, and the destruction of the temple, and the exile of Judea, okay, which is some 140 years approximately after the exile of the 10 northern tribes. Okay, so the people were exiled. That was the end of the first Commonwealth. That's the period called Olei Mitzrayim. So the boundaries of Olei Mitzrayim mean the historical boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, and we should remember that during the biblical period, okay, we had kings such as David and Shlomo who expanded the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. So that means that they conquered, okay, a relatively large amount of territory that is part and parcel of Eretz Yisrael. They also conquered, David in particular conquered, okay, the area that we call Syria, okay, Aram Sova and Aram Naharaim are the 2 parts of Syria that David conquered, that has a separate status, and that's not included in this Mishnah. It's included in the Mishnah following this one that we're not going to have opportunity to look at this evening. Okay, but that has a separate status. But so here we're talking about historical Eretz Yisrael, but since the Mishnah, okay, is compiled, okay, during the second Commonwealth, after the destruction of the Second Temple, but when there's still a very significant Jewish presence in the land, okay, the Jews have some kind of semi-autonomy during the time of the Mishnah. They're ruled by the patriarch, okay, Rabbi Yehuda, who compiles the Mishnahs, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He's the patriarch, who is not only a religious leader, but he's also a political leader, political and national leader of Am Yisrael. So this is still part and parcel of the Second Commonwealth. And the Second Commonwealth had smaller boundaries to Eretz Yisrael than did Olei Mitzrayim. They didn't get as far north, as far south, okay? They didn't settle Transjordan, okay, as the as Olei Mitzrayim had done, and Transjordan again has a separate standing in several places in the halacha. Okay, so these are the 3 levels of Eretz Yisrael as far as Shemitah is concerned. Okay, so let's just look and see what this Mishnah says about the 3. Kol shechziko olei Bavel, that's the real Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Mishnah, because that's what was settled, starting with Ezra, Nehemiah, Shivat Zion, okay, what they the areas that they settled, the areas that were settled in subsequent generations, and those areas which were areas of Jewish settlement during the Second Temple period, the Second Commonwealth, okay, that has full-fledged sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the halacha is lo ne'echal v'lo ne'evad. Okay, the fruit is not eaten, the produce is not eaten, and the land is not worked. Okay, now what exactly that means, we'll come back and look at a bit further on. Okay, but for our purposes now, okay, we'll just take these terms at face value. Then we have a broader area called Shechziku Olei Mitzrayim, but we're not settled during the Second Commonwealth. So that is historical Eretz Yisrael, but it is not settled at the time of the Mishnah and wasn't settled during the Second Temple period. And so that has lesser sanctity, okay, perhaps rabbinic sanctity, perhaps not sanctity from the Torah, okay, but be that as it may, lesser sanctity, and therefore ne'echal, the produce may be consumed, avalo ne'evad, but the land may not be worked. So that's a lower grade status. So these are bordering regions that were not settled during the First Commonwealth, nor during the Second Commonwealth. And so those are ne'echal v'ne'evad. Even though these are areas that adjoin Eretz Yisrael, and areas that adjoin Eretz Yisrael do have some kind of status vis-a-vis some of the other agricultural mitzvot, let's say Shumot u'Masrot, for example, okay, were taken from some of these areas, okay. Nevertheless, as far as Shemittah is concerned, they have no standing whatsoever. Okay, that's the opening Mishnah of chapter 6. And that Mishnah sets the tone for the rest of the chapter. Okay, a good part of the rest of the chapter also talks about the boundaries, okay, and the different laws that apply to different regions that have a greater or lesser degree of sanctity. Let's move on to get a brief introduction to chapter 7. Chapter 7 opens with the term klal gadol, which is interesting. Okay, a great rule, okay, an important rule is the translation that I copied here, but it's actually a large, significant rule. Okay, a great rule was said about Shevi'it. Kalshu ma'achal adam u'ma'achal behema u'mimin hatzovim ve'no mitkayem ba'aretz yesh lo Shevi'it u'ledamav Shevi'it yesh lo bi'ur u'ledamav bi'ur. Okay, and then od klal echad, there's another klal. Okay, anyone who needs can follow in the translation on the left. So you have two levels. One of them is where the species, okay, is perennial. It doesn't disappear, okay, from the land. It doesn't disappear every season and then reappear or replant itself the following season. Okay, so those have all of the laws that are listed here, the laws of Shevi'it, okay, that and its purchase money also have the laws of Shevi'it, yesh lo bi'ur u'ledamav bi'ur, okay, and there are also the laws of bi'ur. Okay, we'll explain what these different laws are in a bit. Okay, then we have those things that have the same qualities except for mitkayem ba'aretz, it does last in land, it is perennial. So then it has the laws of Shevi'it, but not the laws of bi'ur. Okay, now, without getting into detail as to what all these laws are, Shevi'it, bi'ur, and so on, okay, but let's just note one thing that's very clear here, and that is that chapter 7 is now talking about the produce. What does one do with the produce? That's why it opens with kol shehu ma'achal, anything that is food for a man, food for an animal, or a species of dying, which for purposes of Shemitah have a status similar to food. Okay, so then they have the following laws that govern them, and a bit further on we'll talk about what these laws are. But let's move on to chapter 8. Chapter 8, very interestingly, also opens with Klal Gadol. Klal Gadol Amru B'Shvi'it. Okay, another very important principle about Shvi'it. And the principle, it opens with language that's very reminiscent, the language that opens chapter 7. Kol hamyuchad la'ochel adam, anything that is designated as human food. Now, chapter 7 talked about either human food or animal food, or even something that could be used as a dye. But here, anything that is designated specifically for human food, ein osin mimenu melugma la'adam. You cannot make it a plaster. Okay? Plaster be sort of like what we would call a Band-Aid or a bandage. Can't use it as a bandage for a person, and certainly not for an animal, okay? Which is another way of saying you're restricted in what you're allowed to do with it. Food items normally, okay, even though there are halachot about how food items should be treated with respect, you shouldn't use them in a way that doesn't show them proper respect. But there's great latitude in terms of what you can do with them. If you have a wound that is best bandaged by making use of produce, so you can use that produce in order to make a bandage, okay, or for various other kinds of purposes, but not with Shemitah produce. Kol Gadol Amru B'Shvi'it. So chapter 8, like chapter 7, is talking about what may be done with the produce. Okay, the relationship between these chapters we'll look at a little more closely a bit further on. Okay, and let's just get a brief look at chapter 9. Now, interestingly, chapter 9, we're not going to look at the first Mishnah, but the second Mishnah, because the second Mishnah in chapter 9 opens with Shalosh Aratzot BeIyyun, which is very reminiscent of Shalosh Aratzot Shevi'it that opens chapter 6. And what you can see here is that there is a chiastic structure. We'll talk about that in a bit. But first, let's get a zero in a little more on the opening of chapter 9. Shalosh Aratzot BeIyyun. Okay, there are three regions for bi'ur. In chapter 6, rather, we had three regions for Shevi'it. Now we have three regions for bi'ur. Bi'ur appeared in chapter 7, right? Yesh lo Shevi'it and yesh lo bi'ur. Okay, so chapter 9 talks about bi'ur and says bi'ur is divided into three regions. Yehuda ve'ever hayarden ve'galil. Now these three regions are not, as in chapter 6, okay, regions that delineate the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, but boundaries within Eretz Yisrael. Judea, Transjordan, and the Galilee. Yehuda ve'ever hayarden ve'galil. These are three regions within Eretz Yisrael that are applicable to bi'ur. Okay, and what that means, we'll come back and see in a bit. But I just want to dwell for now a little bit on the chiastic structure of these four chapters. Okay, and I've picked representative Mishnayot. And these are opening Mishnayot, and each opening Mishnah reflects a major part of the content of the chapter which it opens. Okay, and again in chapter 9, the opening Mishnah is Mishnah 2. If we have time, we'll look later on at Mishnah 1 and see what it is and why it's there. Okay, but these opening Mishnayot tell us a story. Okay, at the beginning and end of the chiasm, okay, we have Shalosh Aratzot, 3 regions delineating the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael as opposed to outside of Eretz Yisrael, and 3 regions in the land, delineating regions within the land that are important for determining the laws of bi'ur. Okay, and in the center we have 2 Mishnah, excuse me, two chapters devoted to Klal Gadol. They both open with this very unusual phrase. Okay, Klal Gadol, other than appearing in these 2 places, okay, appears in one other place in the Mishnah. We'll take a look at that later on. Okay, very interesting parallel as Bezrat Hashem we'll see. Okay, and chapter the Klal Gadol in both chapters 7 and 8 has to do with how one treats food. Okay, Shemittah produce when used as food, what am I allowed to do with it? Okay, what things am I allowed to do with the Shemittah produce? What are the limitations on my use of these food items during the Shemitah year? That's what chapters 7 and 8 have to do with. Okay, so 6 and 9 delineate the boundaries of the land. Okay, 7 and 8, okay, talk about the use of the produce. Okay, now what we have to think about is, what is the meaning of this chiastic structure? Well, why does the Mishnah structure things in this way? And it seems that the structure of these 4 chapters is challenging us to think about the connection between how we relate to the land and how we relate to the produce of the land, right? Okay, chapters 6 and 9 are talking about the land, how we relate to the land. Chapters 7 and 8 are talking about what can I do with the produce. So there's some interplay here between how I relate to the land and how I relate to the produce of the land. And this theme is actually indicated already in the very first Mishnah of this section. Okay, lo ne'echal v'lo ne'evad. Lo ne'echal tells us how I relate to the produce. Lo ne'evad tells me how I relate to the land. Then I have kol shechzi kol Mitzrayim, and here I divide the 2 from one another. Ne'echal, that's how I relate to the produce. V'lo ne'evad, but I relate to the land differently. And then I come to outside of the framework, ne'echal v'ne'evad. Okay, I have no special relationship either to the land or to its produce. Okay, but here already I'm raising this question of what's the connection between how I relate to the land and how I relate to the produce. And that is the overarching question of this whole section, okay, as we can see in the chiastic structure. Okay, any questions or comments until now?
Looks like there is a question in the chat from Sivan asking about biur, the meaning of the word biur.
Yes. Okay. Okay. That's what we're going to turn to now. Okay. Before we can really try to make any sense out of this structure, we need a little background, and I'm going to present the background in light of the Midrash Halacha. Okay, Mishnah, okay, was compiled, around the end of the 2nd century CE, and it was compiled from all kinds of materials that had been formulated, and much of it had been redacted in one form or another prior to the Mishnah. A lot of those materials found their way into other compilations that were compiled within a couple of generations after the Mishnah. Some of these compilations are called Midrashei Halacha, okay, Tanaitic Midrashim, okay, and on the last 4 books of the Torah, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, we have various Midrashic compilations. Okay, the one Midrashic compilation that we have to the book of Vayikra is called the Sifra, sometimes referred to as Torat Kohanim. So we're going to look at how the Midrash reads the Psukim and what laws the Midrash derives from the Psukim. And that will give us a basic introduction to the terms and ideas that we need in order to understand what the Mishnah is discussing in these 4 chapters. Okay, so let's read together from the Sifra in Parshat Bahar. Etzviach kitzircha lo tiktzor, mikan samchu chachamim al hasvichim sheyihu asurim b'shvi'it. Okay, when the Torah says that the produce that grows on its own, safiach, is produce that grows on its own, because I'm not allowed to plant during Shemitah, but produce that grows on its own, okay, the Torah says don't harvest. Now, we'll see in a bit that not harvesting doesn't mean I can't pick the produce. I can't detach it from the ground and make use of it. Okay, what it means within the framework of the Torah is don't harvest it in the normal fashion. Okay, we'll see a basis for that in just another minute. Okay, so normally, today a farmer will bring in a combine and come through and harvest large swaths of land at a time. In ancient times, you would take a scythe, okay, and spend a day out in the field, and also you would harvest a large quantity. Okay, what one worker could harvest in a day, okay, will probably last the normal family for several weeks, if not months. Okay, and the owner of the field, okay, will have many people out in the field if he's got a large field, with many people out in the field working on the harvest, and he'll harvest enough to sustain his household for the entire year, okay, and probably have a significant amount of it that he can take to market and sell it to other people less fortunate than he, who don't have their own fields to harvest. That's the normal way of harvesting. That's what you're not allowed to do during the Shemitah. But we have here mikan samchu chachamim. We have a rabbinic injunction not to utilize the svichim at all. Now, svichim, okay, are annuals, not perennials. Okay, so that includes most kinds of grains and vegetables. Okay, would be the annuals, and even if they grow on their own, you can't make use of them during Shemitah. The reason for that is, again, because of Ovrei Avera. Okay, if we have a chance to look at the opening Mishnah of chapter 9, we'll see that when we look at that Mishnah. Okay, since there would be many people who violated Shemitah, what some of them would do is they would plant, and then when everything would sprout, so they'd say, "Oh, okay, gee, I was lucky this year; it all sprouted on its own." Okay, so since these are annuals, it's very hard to check whether the person is on the up and up. Okay, so the Chachamim simply said this is prohibited. That's why in Eretz Yisrael today, it's a much bigger problem to find vegetables that don't have a Shemitah issue involved with them than it is to find fruits, because fruits are generally perennials. Okay, the tree doesn't regenerate every year. Okay, and so there's no problem sfichim with fruit, but there is with vegetables. Okay, vetinvei nazirecha lo tivtzor min hashamur ba'aretz enat habotzer. The Midrash is reading the word nizirecha as something that has been bounded, something that has been guarded. Okay, you shall not harvest the grapes that have been guarded. But you may harvest grapes that have been left free for anyone to take, and then every individual can take them, including the owner. But how may he take them? Lo tivtzor, that's the third line. Lo tivtzor kederech habotzrim. Don't harvest them in the normal fashion. Mikan amru teinim shel shvi'it ein kotzim otam b'muktzeh, v'kotzeh otam b'churva, ein dorchim anavim bagat, avol dorchim ba'areva. Okay, don't gather them in the usual manner, which the continuation seems to indicate is more a matter of quantity than it is of quality. In other words, if I want to use a scythe, that's not a problem. But it probably wouldn't pay that much because the scythe is for large amounts. Okay, here I can just take a knife or a scissors and it'll be good enough because I can only take a small amount. Okay, so for example, I can't press my grapes in a grape press, okay, in a wine press, but I can take a kneading trough and press my grapes there, because that's a much smaller framework. Okay, so that would not be a violation of Shemitah. Okay, or to put it a little bit differently, when I harvest small quantities, so I'm like everybody else. Okay, I take for my immediate domestic consumption, and leave the rest out in the field for my neighbors to come and for animals to roam in and to help themselves. So I'm no worse than anybody else. So I'm also no better than anybody else. So that's what lo tiktzor and lo tivtzor mean according to the pshat. Vayta Shabbat haaretz lachem. The continuation of the pasuk is lachem leochla. Okay, so the produce is for us to eat. So now, min hashavut ba'aretz ataochel ve'en ataochel min hashamur. Once again, you are not entitled to eat from those fruits that were guarded. In other words, if I have shown this is mine, I'm keeping everybody else out. I'm building fences. I'm putting up guards. I'm not letting anybody else in. Then I'm not allowed to make use of them at all. But if I've opened my field to everyone, then I am entitled to make use of the produce. Lachem. Okay, Vayta Shabbat haaretz lachem. So the Midrash says lachem v'lo la'achirim. Okay, this is for Jews, not for non-Jews. Lo'ochla v'lo la'avi mimeno menachot v'lo la'avi nesachim mimeno. I can't use it for sacrifices. I can use it for eating, not for other things. In other words, my use of Shemitah produce is also limited. It's limited in quantity. It's also limited in terms of what I can do with it. I can't do with it whatever I like. Think back to the Mishnah's ruling not to use it, okay, as a bandage for a wound. Okay, v'achlu evyonei amecha, says the Midrash, shechol ein li ala perot shvi'it nechalim ele la'aniyim bilvad. So perhaps from the pasuk it sounds like the only ones who can eat from the Shemitah produce are the poor. Minayin af lashirim. How do I know that the rich can also eat from Shemitah produce? Tamud lamar lecha lavdecha v'lamatecha. Okay, so it says for you as well as for your servants. So for you means for the wealthy landowner as well. Imken lama ne'amar v'achlu avyonei amecha. Okay, so why does the Torah single out the aniyim? What gives them more rights? Aniyim ochlim achar biur v'lo ashirim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Because there's something called biur, which we will define in just a bit. And past the time called biur, Only aniyim are entitled to eat, not ashirim, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei Omer, echad aniyim, echad ashirim, ochlim achar abiyur, and he doesn't really answer the question why the Torah singles out the aniyim. And finally, Shuomer v'livhem techav lachaya, makish behema lachaya. The Torah is comparing the domestic animal to the wild animal. Kol zman shechaya ochelet basadeh, behema ochelet babayit. Kala lachaya shebasadeh, kala livhem techa shebabayit. Okay, as long as it is available to the beast of the field, so then you can bring some of it and give it to your domestic animals. But once it is no longer available to the beasts of the field, then you have to remove it from the animals in your household. This is the halacha that we call bi'ur. Bi'ur means as long as the produce is still growing and available in the field, okay, so since it's available to all, then whatever I have gathered into my house, and remember, we've seen earlier, I can only gather small amounts into my house. Whatever I've gathered into my house is legit. I can make use of it for my family, for my animals. But once it is no longer available in the fields, I have to miva'er, I have to remove it from my house. I can't maintain it in my house. In other words, I am no more privileged than the beasts of the field. As long as they have access to it, what I have in my house is fair game for me and for my household. If they don't have access to it, I have to remove from my house whatever it is that I'd gathered in earlier. That's the halacha that's called bi'ur. Okay, so now let's go back and look again at what we've seen in these 4 chapters.
Rabbi Walfish, is this a good time to interrupt with a question from the chat?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so Ruth is asking, but does not prohibiting eating of the, and forgive me for not being able to pronounce that word correctly, I think it's adventitious growth negatively impact the poor who rely on leket and pe'ah?
Yes, it will indeed impact on them. And that's why I think that the main theme of Shemitah is not to support the poor. Okay, I don't think that's the main point of Shemitah. The main point of Shemitah is to renounce my control over the land, to acknowledge the fact that this land is not really fully mine. It really belongs to God, and therefore my rights in the land are equal to the rights of everybody else. So in that regard, it is a great equalizer. Okay, in that sense, it does have a social component. Okay, I and other members of the society, we're all equal. We all approach this land from the same vantage point with the same rights and obligations. But in terms of support, very likely the poor will get less support than the rich. Okay, and in fact, maybe I can actually open this up and we'll see the Mishnah explicitly. Okay, so I won't just have to say this outside. Let's find the Mishnah. Okay. Okay, there's a question that comes up in a Mishnah elsewhere, Masechet Yadayim, okay, which asks, Amonu Moav, that's Transjordan, Mahin Bashvi'it, what is their law during Shemitah? Rabbi Tarfon, Gazar Rabbi Tarfon Maser Ani, Gazar Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah Maser Sheni. Okay, so now, inside Eretz Yisrael, there are no laws of Trumot Masrot during Shemitah because the produce is all hefker. Okay, it's all hefker, it's all ownerless, and therefore there are no Trumot Masrot. But in Transjordan, where we don't have the full-fledged laws of Shemitah, so they do have Trumotu Masrot, and the question is, okay, every first, second, fourth, and fifth year of a Shemitah cycle, okay, the second Maaser, the second tithe, is Maaser Sheni, which you bring up and to Yerushalayim and eat it in sanctity. But every third and sixth year, you have Maaser Ani, which is used to support the poor. So the question is, Ammon and Moab will have, on the one hand, they are an adjoining territory to Eretz Yisrael, so they have Trumotu Masrot rabbinically, okay, and they will have them even during a Shemitah year because they don't have the laws of Shemitah. So now, which Maaser will they have, Maaser Ani or Maaser Sheni? Okay, and so, so the Mishnah says, if we look here, okay, you can all see the the second line on your screen right now. Okay, it says Shehem Krovim. These lands are close to Eretz Yisrael. Na'asim Maaser Ani. We will make them into Maaser Ani and not Maaser Sheni. Why? Sheyu Aniyei Yisrael nismachim alehem b'shvi'it. In order to support the poor of Israel during the Shemitah year. Okay, in other words, since we are talking about lands that are close to Eretz Yisrael, the poor who during the Shemitah year are actually getting less produce than they normally get in a normal year, because as someone mentioned, they don't get leket shichau peyah, okay, which they would get in a normal year. Okay, so what they can do is they can cross the Jordan River and find Maaser Ani, okay, which can support them during the Shemitah. So this Mishnah, I think, indicates quite quite clearly that let's go back to, indicates quite clearly that that during the Shemitah year, the poor are actually not supported fully from what there is in Eretz Yisrael. But again, I think the main idea of the Shemitah year is not to support the poor, but to equalize, okay, to relinquish control and at the same time to make a social statement about equality. Okay, now we're in a position to understand the terms that we had in these four chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay, so first let's talk about Yeshlo Shvi'it Ulidamav Shvi'it, Yeshlo Bi'ur Ulidamav Bi'ur. Okay, so anything that is designed for consumption, that means machal adam or machal bema or use as dye, okay, if it is something that is annual and not perennial, so it will disappear from the field at a certain point, okay, it will not last. So then, in addition to the laws of Shvi'it, the laws of Shvi'it have to do with how I'm allowed to consume it. Those laws will be detailed in chapter 8. We'll see this in a couple of minutes. Okay, so it has the laws of Shvi'it. Its purchase money will also have the laws of Shvi'it. Notice you have to use the money for the same purpose for which you could use the produce. But also, Yeshlo Bi'ur, L'damav Bi'ur. Beyond the date when it disappears from the field, you will have to remove it from your house. And if money was used to purchase Shemitah produce, that money would have to be removed from your house. But if it's the sort of thing that lasts throughout the year, it doesn't disappear from the field, so then it has the laws of Shemitah produce, does not have the laws of Bi'ur. Okay, so now we've understood those terms in chapter 7. We can also understand chapter 8. Einosin mimenu milugma la'adam. Okay, things that are designed for consumption, for human consumption, you can't use them for other purposes. They can be used only for consumption. But kol she'eino miyuchad lo'ochel adam, if it's something that could be consumed that's not designated specifically for human consumption, can be consumed by animals, then you have more flexibility into how you can use it. This is the law that we normally refer to as Kedushat Shevi'it. Okay, since the produce has sanctity, the sanctity means you can use it for some purposes and not for others. So if it's designed for human consumption, you must limit it to human consumption. Okay, if it's for animal consumption, then that gives you a lot more leeway. Okay, and now we can understand the opening of chapter 9. Shalosh haratzot levi'ur. Okay, Yuda ve'ever Yaden beGalil. Now, why are there 3 regions for bi'ur? Lama amru shalosh haratzot. Because when I say it's available in the field, doesn't mean it's available in my personal field. It means it's available in the field in my region. So we divide the land into 3 regions. Okay, and as long as within that region it's available in the fields, even if not in my field or my neighbor's field, but if you go over to a neighboring community, you'll find that it's available in those fields. As long as we're all within one region, Judah, Transjordan, or the Galilee, so then bi'ur doesn't yet go into effect. And bi'ur is defined separately for each of these 3 regions. Okay, so now we've understood these terms. Now, to get a bit more of a sense of this chiastic structure, let's take a closer look at the opening of chapter 6. What does it mean, lo ne'echal? We said Kedushat Shevi'it means that's exactly what you do. You eat the produce. So areas that have Shemitah laws, you do eat the produce. So what does the Mishnah mean when it says you don't eat? So the Mefarshim suggest 3 possible answers. Okay, one answer is by an early Mishnah commentator called Ri ben Malki Tzedek from Italy, okay, who explains ne'echal means afilu lachara biur. So when we say that there's a region, okay, which has Shemitah laws and therefore the produce can't be eaten, it means it can't be eaten beyond the cutoff date of biur. Rambam says it means asur lechol hasfichim atzomchim botah haaretz. Okay, when you say you can't eat the produce, lo ne'echal, you can't eat the produce means you can't eat the svichim produce. Okay, anything that comes from a perennial plant, let's say from a tree, you can eat, b'kedushat shvi'it. But when it says lo ne'echal, it means svichim produce can't be eaten. Again, because of the rabbinic injunction. And Bartanura suggests 2 explanations. The explanation he prefers is the first one, but beforehand he suggests another explanation. Im nevda v'gadla asur le'echol me'otam gidulim. Okay, that what you can't eat is produce from land that has been worked. When the land has been worked, then the produce becomes prohibited. And now, there's a common theme to all these 3 interpretations, and that is that when the Mishnah says lo ne'echal, what determines lo ne'echal is how I'm supposed to relate to the land. What I can do with the produce depends on how I relate to the land. Let's see how that plays out. Let's start off with the third interpretation, the Bartanura. The Bartanura says, okay, only produce from land that hasn't been worked is allowed. So when we say lo ne'echal v'lo ne'evad, lo ne'evad means you can't work the land, and lo ne'echal means, and if you did work the land, you can get no benefit from it because you're not allowed to enjoy the produce. Rambam makes the connection between land and produce a little more tenuous because he says it's a problem of sfichim. But why is sfichim prohibited during Shemitah? Because of the concern that people who have because of the concern that people might have violated Shemitah and planted things and pretended they grew on their own. So what the Rambam is saying, the Rambam is also connecting what you do with the produce with what you're allowed to do with the land. Produce suspected of coming from worked land is prohibited. So the Bartanura is talking about produce from land that has actually been worked. Rambam is talking about produce that comes from land that we suspect might have been worked. And Reben Malki Tzedek says, produce may be consumed normally as long as it is freely available in the land. He says it's to eat it after the bi'ur. In areas that are prohibited, lo ne'echal, it means once it's not available in the land, you can't get benefit from it in the house either. So all three of them, in fact, are telling us that what happens with the produce reflects the way you're supposed to relate to the land. And I think that gives us the key to understanding this chiastic structure of the 4 chapters. Okay, the framing part of the chapters tells us how to relate to the land. The land of Israel has delineated boundaries. Within the land of Israel, I have delineated regions. Okay, those regions define the settlement, the society that is living in the land. Okay, so these basically tell us how I relate to the land. Okay, the laws of Shemitah give me a perspective on the land. What are the boundaries of the land? What are the regions of the land? What are the social divisions? Okay, the part of the society that lives in this region or that region. This gives me the definition of the land. And that in turn governs what appears in the 2 middle chapters, what I am entitled to do with the produce. Okay, because the produce, okay, when I look at the produce, and I think this is what is unique about the Shemitah year. During a normal year, once I've gathered, okay, the land is instrumental. Okay, I have a utilitarian way of viewing the land and approaching it. The land is designed for enabling me to produce from the land what I want and what I need. And I gather it however I like. And I dispose of it however I like. I can gather large quantities. I can market some of them. I can make use of those things that I have in my house for whatever needs I might need to meet. Okay, so the land is looked at from a utilitarian perspective. Okay, and the produce is really the goal. I'm using the land in order to obtain the produce. During the Shemitah year, what I think we're doing is inverting that way of looking at it. The produce is a reflection of the land. Because I am supposed to abandon the land, I'm supposed to relinquish my control of the land. Say, this is not my land. I can't work it. I can't plant I can't plant it. I can't restrict people from going through my land. Okay, I have to leave things open and let people wander through my land. So I'm relating to this land not in a utilitarian fashion, but in a sense, I'm sort of anthropomorphizing the land. I'm personifying the land. Remember how the Torah presents Shemittah, V'shavta haaretz, the land shall rest. Okay, so when I'm letting the land rest, I'm treating the land, okay, as an entity with which I have a relationship. Okay, in a way, to view it in Buberian terms, I have it not an I-it relationship to the land, but an I-thou relationship to the land. Okay, the land is in and of itself something to which I have a relationship. And part of that relationship is, this is the land given me by God. And so it's very dear to me. And it's a land that connects me to God. That makes it all the dearer to me. So because I have this relationship to the land, the produce, my relationship to the produce reflects my relationship to the land. I can't do whatever I want to with the produce. Whenever I want to dispose of the produce, first thing I have to do is say, okay, what land did this come from? Did this come from land that was worked? Is it available now in the land? Is it readily available throughout the land? I have to answer those questions before I can make any use of that produce, because it's not the land serving a utilitarian purpose of providing me with the produce. It's the produce reflecting a relationship to the land. And so I treat the produce with respect. I treat it as sacred insofar as it reflects the land, which I relate to as a sacred land. Okay, so I think that will give us an understanding of the chiastic structure of these chapters. Okay, one final point with which I want to conclude, and that comes back to the klal gadol point. Okay, there's one other place in the Mishnah that has klal gadol, and that is, not altogether surprisingly, Masechet Shabbat. Klal gadol amru b'Shabbat, and the klal gadol has to do with when I violate Shabbat. Okay, I violate several Shabbatot and several Melachot on every Shabbat. Is that all one big long transgression? The Shabbat is one entity? Or do I say I have violated every single Shabbat day? I violated the day? Or do I say every forbidden activity is another violation? Okay, so each activity is defined. That's the klal gadol that opens Masechet Shabbat. Now, something very interesting to note, that Shevi'it and Shabbat both have klal gadol is interesting. We already saw in the first chapter, as we saw in the Psukim, the Torah, that Shabbat and Shevi'it have a very close relationship. Shevi'it is called a Shabbat Lashem. But note which chapter it says klal gadol in Shabbat, chapter 7. And in what chapter does it say klal gadol in Shevi'it? Chapter 7. Also chapter 8. But first of all, in chapter 7. Okay, I think the Mishnah is making a very clear statement by bringing us this interrelationship between Shabbat and Shemitah. Okay, the number 7, which is so central both to Shabbat and Shemitah, is the chapter in which the klal gadol appears. Okay, now point with which we'll conclude is that there are another few places in the Mishnah, two of them in Masechtot that are very close to Shevi'it, that talk not about a klal gadol, but klal amru b'masrot and klal amru b'pei'ah. And there's a sugya, it appears both in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, in Masechet Shabbat that relates all of these klalim. Okay, I won't take the time to read through it, but I'll just tell you the idea. What the sugya, both in the Bavli and in the Yerushalmi, tells us is that the klal of Shabbat is the greatest of the klalim, because on Shabbat all work is prohibited, both agricultural work and work that is not agricultural. All kinds of labor are prohibited on Shabbat. During Shemitah, only agricultural labor is permitted. Okay, now in Shemitah, okay, the klal of Shemitah is a klal gadol vis-a-vis the klal of Masrot, because the klal of Shemitah applies both to human food and to animal food. Maaser applies only to human food, kol shehu ochel. And the klal of maaser is greater than the klal of pe'ah, okay, because maaser applies to anything that is food and is preserved, guarded. Okay, a person maintains ownership over it, and it grows from the ground. Whereas pe'ah has those three conditions, but adds another two restrictive conditions, that it's all harvested together, because you can't have the poor hanging around all year to wait. The poor gather only when there's a harvest season, and machniso l'kiyum, okay, which reminds us again of Shemitah, mitkayem ba'aretz, same term, kiyum and mitkayem, okay, and it's something that lasts, okay, and the poor are entitled to gather food that will last them for a period of time, not food that needs to be consumed right away. Okay, and what effectively the Talmud is telling us is that when we look at all of these klalim together, they're telling you a story. The story is, how does God convey to us the idea that our property is not really ours? That the property, that the land that he has given us doesn't really fully belong to us. He entitles us to enjoy it, but he has strings attached where he says, you know what, I'm the real owner, I'm the real boss here, and you have to acknowledge my ultimate sovereignty over this land. Okay, and the story is told moving up the ladder from pe'ah, that's restricted to only certain kinds of humanly produce designed for human consumption, moving up the ladder to ma'asrot, the tithing, that applies to all kinds of produce that are for human consumption. Then Shemitah extends that even beyond to animal food. Because in Shemitah, I also have to care for the animals, not only for the human beings in the society. And from there, moving on up to Shabbat, okay, which is God's ultimate control, where he says, you have to abandon any kind of work, not only agricultural work in the field. You have to recognize that the whole world belongs to me, and therefore you have to rest on that day. I will close with that point for this evening. Thank you all for your attention.
Rabbi Walfish?
Yes.
Oh yeah, it looks like we have a question from Ruth.
So,
Yes.
and you could say that it has not escaped our notice that the malacha of Shabbat is an anagram for the ma'achal of all the other.
Oh, very nice. Okay. Very, very nice. Okay. That
Okay,
did escape my attention, but it's a nice thought.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Walfish. If there's no more questions, I don't think there are additional questions. So thank you for this interesting session. I'm looking forward to next week. We have the fourth and final session next week of this class. Thank you also to everyone who joined us today, not only here on Zoom, but also on Facebook and on Drisha Live. We'll go live again tomorrow with a class at 8 p.m. The Covenantal Commandment, the Sabbatical Year in the Bible with Rabbi Silber. You can always find out information about classes and registration links on our website, www.drisha.org/classes. And you can watch classes live and the recordings of the classes at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn
Can
with
I
you,
ask
Rabbi Walfish. And
one question?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
Was there a difference between what Rabbi Walfish had on the screen and the source sheets that were distributed?
Yes.
I couldn't follow half the time. Not half the time. Some of the time I couldn't see the text. So it's not me. That's all I want to affirm.
Yes.
I did modify the sheet somewhat.
Could we get the sheets you used? That would be great.
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So Rabbi Walfish, if you send it to
I'll
Kayla.
send them out and
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for pointing that out. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone. And we really look
Yes.
forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha, hopefully tomorrow.
Great.
okay. Thank you.